Hi class, this is the last lecture of World Religions, Online World Religions, and we're going to be talking about new religious movements, or what some people refer to as cults. And I wanted to start by giving you kind of a more sociological background to the terms and also kind of a brief history of new religious movements in America, because we've been especially good at creating them. So to start out this last module, I want you to be thinking about these two questions. How do religions begin? What are your hypotheses about that? And what do we learn about religion in general from answering this question? Because remember, I'm really asking you to consider what is the nature of religion in this class. Not simply memorize a bunch of factoids, but really engage in some meaningful reflection on what do religions do for society and for human beings. So here are some possible explanations that historians and sociologists use to explain new religions emerging. So, of course, there's the classic divisions emerge in an older religion. We saw this in Islam, we saw this in Christianity, we saw this in Judaism, we saw this in Buddhism. So there are divisions that emerge in an established religion, and then we have new religious movements. The other example of a new religious movement is when an older religion moves into a new culture and is changed. So when Buddhism went to China and Tibet, it was changed. When Buddhism went to Japan, it was changed. When Christianity traveled to many different parts of the globe, it was changed. There is also the example of two or more religions blending. Now, we haven't, I used to cover this, but I tried to pare back because there's just so many options out there. But the Sikh religion is actually a blending of Islam and Hinduism. And it's one of the newest world religions, established world religions, that is started in the 1500s. The other way that a new religion starts is an individual begins a new religion as a result of some kind of revelation. They have some kind of spiritual experience, an awakening, and they start talking about it, and it starts a new religion. The other example, which you may not realize, is an individual or a group try to revive old practices and beliefs of religion. It was about 5 or 6 years ago, there was an article about a revival of the worship of Greek gods and goddesses in the city of Boston. It was very weird, but was an example of a group of people trying to revive an old religion in a new way. So the big thing that I want you to understand is how this word cults came about and how we want to differentiate these terms, sects and cults. I will say this, these are sociological definitions, the sociology of religion. So a sect is often a large movement that emerges from an established religion. It can have many members, and it has a fairly loose structure. So that's why Shia Islam is referred to as a sect. When United Methodism or Methodism started in Great Britain, it was a sect of the Anglican Church. The big thing is that in a sect, the authorities only have mild or moderate control over individuals. And that's one of the defining differences between what are termed sects and what are termed cults. So the cult often emerges independently. They have a small number of followers, And this is really key. In order for something to be, quote unquote, a cult, it really needs to be socially isolated in some way. And it's often under the control of a charismatic, authoritarian, and or dictatorial leader who controls all aspects of the follower's life. So I want you to notice that is the hallmark of what sociologists would call a dangerous cult. But notice the word cult is most often used as a negative label. So I think what happens sometimes is people use the word cult for sex that they don't like. But I think it's better to be really clear that a negative cult has these other characteristics. And the other thing is that in a cult, it doesn't have a loose structure, and the people can't come and go. So that's really the big difference between a sect and a cult. So one of the hallmarks of new religious movements and why they appeal to certain people is that as a new religious movement is starting out, they have small groups. So there's more intimacy among the religious participants. The other thing we can see, especially in the US from the 18th century to the 19th century and the 20th century, is the importance of women as leaders. Oftentimes women were not allowed to be leaders or spiritual leaders in different religions. And so we can see that some of these new religious movements started because women were leaders, and that was the only way they could have something to say, which I find interesting. Now these are generalizations, but it's often true that new religious movements have active devotional life, frequently mystical, so they kind of feed the person's, if you believe in such a thing as a soul, but they give them lots of support and activities to keep them spiritual. There's also an emphasis on clear practices for self-cultivation. We're going to see this in a lot of the examples that we examine in part 2 of this lecture series. Ask yourself, what else would you add? So William James is a great American philosopher and psychologist who has a lot to say about religion. So I really find what he has to say intriguing. He says that religions are based and founded on the religious experience of the founder. In a lot of cases, this is true. So you see that as a pattern that emerges. Now, William James himself was an agnostic. He came from a very religious family of people who followed the faith of Swedenborgianism, which I'm not going to go into, but it's something, if you're interested in learning more and going down a rabbit hole, that's another place to go. He believed that the faith of believers is not rooted in the rational appeal of religious doctrine, but in the emotions and experience. Now, this is what I love about William James. He says that his hypothesis was people were attracted to different religious experiences and different quote-unquote religions or sects or whatever because of their temperament, their personality. You know, some people like quiet and silence. Some people like rolling around in the aisles. That's, he said, not a rational or logical appeal, but an appeal to emotion or temperament. He did, however, have a pretty clearly judgmental idea about, he categorized religion as there were two types of religion, and you can see there's a dividing line. He said there was a healthy-minded religion, which is an optimistic, pluralistic religion where individual works toward moral wholeness and works toward the world's perfection. So he saw religions that cultivated people, allowed them to expand, to look out to the world and help other people and not push people away, as a healthy-minded religion. He did, however, have a negative view on a second type of religion that he called the sick soul religion. A needy, dependent religion where an individual is passive and just desires comfort and reassurance, and also that views other religions as misguided. So William James' viewpoint on religion is that any religion that looked down on other religions was a sick soul religion. So what do you think about William James' hypothesis? Okay, so this is a really interesting new religious movement that started in the US. I don't know how many of you have heard of it before, but it was quite infamous because it's kind of a doomsday cult that was founded, or new religious movement that was founded by this guy, Marshall Applethwaite. You see a picture. He called himself Doh, D-O-H. And a friend of his, Bonnie Nettles, who had been a nurse in the early 70s. And they created this, they were looking at the book of Revelation in Christianity and kind of combined some elements of Christianity, mysticism, kind of sci-fi, and asceticism. Of course, asceticism is like the whole idea that you should be celibate. So we're going to see this is also a trend in some new religious movements. So the co-founder, Bonnie Nettles, died of cancer in the 1980s. So I don't know if the same thing would have happened if she hadn't died, because I think that might have pushed Marshall over the edge. They didn't have a relationship. They were just friends. But he outlined this idea that, human beings would ascend. The ones who were chosen would be ascend and become aliens. And because he was convinced that there was going to be a UFO trailing behind the comet Hale-Bopp in March of 1997, he convinced 39 or 38 of his followers to commit suicide in March of 1997. So, and the reason why I would say a sociologist would call this a cult is because Marshall Applethwaite completely dominated the lives of these followers. There's all these weird pictures of them with their Nike shoes, and many of them were computer programmers who worked at night, and he had them sleep through the day. So he's kind of like controlling their sleep cycles. And I remember seeing him interviewed in 1997 before this happened, and he was really creepy. He would say, Christianity was considered a cult by the Roman Empire. That was his voice. I'll try and link a good video so you can check it out. But he's right. At the time of the Roman Empire, the Romans thought Christianity was a weird cult where people met in secret to drink the blood and eat the body of their Lord and Savior. So, I thought I would start by telling you about one of the earliest and most long-standing new religious movements that was prominent in the U.S. There's not very many of them left today, but it's the Shaker community. And the Shakers' theme is hands to work, hearts to God, heart to God. And it was started by this woman, Mother Ann Lee, who was British, and she had a particularly awful time with several miscarriages, which led her to a belief that sexual intercourse was wrong. Um, and so she and her followers settled in upstate New York in the 1770s. So before the revolution happened, they were established in the US. Now, I happen to know about this for several reasons, but my older brother lives and works at the remaining what was a Shaker school in New Lebanon, New York, called Darrow School. And so there's all these Shaker buildings. I could have done a whole I could have done a whole teaching just about this one community. But one of the things that's so interesting, and you see a picture of them in their dancing practice, and you can see that the men and women are on opposite aisles and they have their hands held up in this kind of strange manner, but they're dancing together. So one of the things that's so interesting is it was pretty radical because they believed in living together in community and they were celibate, supposedly. They believed in the equality of the sexes. They believed in the equality of the sexes in the late 1700s. How about that? They were pacifists, so they didn't believe in serving in the military, and they had practices of charismatic worship, working together. They grew a lot, actually, in the 19th century, and you might wonder why. So in the 1800s, actually runaway slaves and people who were leaving the South found, or people who were, just on their own, found support and community in the Shaker community. But by 1920, there were only 12 communities left in the U.S. Of course, if you have as a rule that you have to remain celibate, you can see how the numbers would dwindle. There's only one living community left, which is in Maine. But you can see they kind of establish a whole style of furniture, which you might have heard of before. But it's one of the great examples of a very interesting new religious movement that really took hold in the U.S. as early as 1774. So there were a lot of new religious movements in America, partly because, we were, as a nation, really founded on this ideal of religious freedom and the idea that people who were sincerely trying to practice their own religion often moved here. I mean, that's not the only reason, but, that's a prominent feature of our history. So one author said that in the 1830s and the 1840s, there was a whole group of movements that were sort of apocalyptic. So they were end of the world movements, which are called millenarian movements. And then there were also perfectionist movements who were all about perfecting and purifying the spiritual life, and communal living. So the whole idea of living together in community is also something that would make other people look askance at some of these new religious movements and be another reason why they would be considered cults, although you don't really see the word cult reaching prominence until the 20th century. There were also, interestingly enough, during this time period, a lot of interesting ideas about sexual innovation, so different kinds of marriage practices. So the 1850s to the 1880s really focused more on spiritualism. So kind of these movements, Theosophy, the Indian Asian gurus at the World's Fair in Chicago, namely Swami Vivekananda, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because this was a really important event that happened. The Chicago World's Fair was 1893, and it sort of introduced a lot of people of the world and people of America to a whole range of different kinds of spirituality and a different kind of religion. We also see the beginning of what's termed the New Age movement. So focus on occult and astrology and tarot readings and mediums talking to the dead. In the 1900s, we see again some apocalyptic movements like the Jehovah's Witnesses. There were also movements that focused on metaphysical healing, Christian Science, started by Mary Baker Eddy, and other schools of New Thought, like the Unity Church, which talked about, sort of the healing of the mind. I know a little bit more about this because my paternal grandmother was a Christian Scientist. Very interesting. Okay, so this is one of the really interesting movements that started in the 1840s. Again, this guy, John Humphrey Noyes, was a divinity student at Yale Divinity School. And so he was a Christian, and he believed that conversion brought a release from sin, and that people should live together, and they did, and they practice, and I have this in quotes, complex marriage. It was really a kind of situation where people could have multiple partners, and there was not a traditional nuclear family. But it wasn't just like free-form random sex, but it was definitely a kind of orchestrated notion of a very different social organization of marriage. And that they would have this kind of it was a little bit hierarchical, but they had what was called a system of mutual criticism, where people would challenge each other that they were following the spirituality practices, and that in order to go on to perfection, once you were converted, the goal was then, okay, you're released from sin, so the goal after conversion is to move on to perfection. Now, the most interesting thing about this, I think, today is that, when these communities were founded and they were like a commune, they had to figure out a way of making money to support the commune. Well, the Oneida community made silverware. That's right. If you go to Bed Bath & Beyond to this day, you can see Oneida silverware. And so this was started as a new religious movement that believed in group sex. And in fact, in 1881, they decided that they would just become a company that made silverware. They were no longer a new religious movement. Isn't that fascinating? So again, I mentioned the Chicago World's Fair. So the picture on the left is a picture of the great white city that was created in Chicago. The recent movie about Edison talks about, which you should all go see, is a film about that, about how the lights, electricity, the march for who was going to light up this World's Fair. In any case, the other thing that happened that was very interesting is that at the Chicago World's Fair, there was introduced this Parliament for Council on World Religions. And people, representatives of all of these different faith traditions, from Zen Buddhism to Theravada Buddhism to Hinduism to different branches of Christianity, Theosophy, all sorts of different new religious movements were represented. And Swami Vivekananda really made a huge hit. He was a Hindu guru who happened to be a student of Ramakrishna. Now, if some of you remember from way back in the module on Hinduism, some of you might have read and even written on the essay by Ramakrishna, who referred to God as Mother and talked about how all religions were true. So he was a student, and he really influenced, and some of the other things that happened at this Parliament for Council on World Religions really started introducing in the US at the end of the 19th century, introduced Americans to a whole range of new types of religiosity and religious practices that before this time were just unknown to people. So this was really a breakthrough moment in the history of the US and also the world. So the 20th century movements we see from the beginning, they're messiahs everywhere. And I wish I could find a good picture of him, but there was this movement in the Midwest of men who believed in not shaving their beards, and they had a baseball team, and their messiah was called King Ben. I've kind of lost track of the name of the group, but it's fascinating. And then I'll talk to you in the second part about Krishnamurti and how he was seen as a messiah. We see, again, female leadership of early 20th century movements. So Ellen White was a great mover and shaker in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Aimee Semple McPherson was a leader in the Pentecostalist movement. Mary Baker Eddy in Christian Science. So these were ways in which female leadership really took hold. Of course, then in the 1960s, there were many new Christian movements and Asian movements from the Hare Krishnas. The Hare Krishnas was a spin-off kind of sect, new religious movement from Hinduism. And then the very awful Charles Manson followers. Although the Church of Scientology was really started in the 1950s, it really took off in the 70s. And then, of course, there was the Unification Church. So we can see lots of things. And then in the 21st century, we have this faux new religious movement called Pastafarianism, which was actually started by a physics grad student, Bobby Henderson, who was so disturbed by what was happening in Kansas with some school board in Kansas that wanted to say that creationism should have equal status with the theory of evolution. And he challenged that by creating this fake religion, Pastafarianism, whose icon was the flying spaghetti monster. So that piece of artwork was done by Arne Janssen. So interestingly enough, the Pastafarianism has been deemed not a real religion by the US government, but if you're in New Zealand, a Pastafarian minister can officiate at a wedding. So we see here that a whole range of new religious movements that this is kind of sarcastic. The Pastafarian religion is kind of sarcastic, but it was really challenging the notion that you could just make up something and have it be a doctrine that the school board would say was equivalent to science. So